In the waning years of the 3rd century BCE, a foreign envoy found himself navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the imperial palace in the heart of the Qin dynasty. His mission was simple on paper: deliver tribute and secure favor with Emperor Wu of Qin, the man who had, through fire and blood, unified the fragmented states of China into a single empire. Yet what awaited him was far from the grandeur he had anticipated. Instead of the benevolent ruler celebrated in distant lands, the envoy was drawn into a shadowed world where whispers clung to the walls like damp moss, and the air was thick with an unspoken dread. From the moment he crossed the threshold, the envoy sensed an unsettling atmosphere. Servants moved with hurried glances, their faces pale and drawn, avoiding eye contact as if fearing to share secrets they dared not speak aloud. Courtiers exchanged furtive looks, their conversations halting abruptly whenever an outsider approached. Rumors swirled like a dark mist. The emperor was no ordinary sovereign, but a man possessed by a twisted obsession that defied understanding. Tales spoke of unnatural feasts held behind closed doors, where the usual delicacies of the realm were replaced by something far more sinister: human flesh. These stories were initially dismissed as court gossip or the exaggerations of rivals seeking to undermine the emperor's reputation. Yet as the envoy delved deeper into the palace's inner sanctum, the whispers grew louder and more persistent. Servants who had once smiled fell silent, eyes haunted by memories too terrible to recount. The palace itself seemed to pulse with a hidden horror, its ornate halls concealing a darkness that no amount of imperial splendor could disguise. Emperor Wu of Qin, the man responsible for the unification of China, was rumored to have embarked on a path of madness, driven by an insatiable desire for immortality and absolute power. The envoy learned that this obsession was not merely a philosophical pursuit or a quest for longevity through conventional means, but a macabre fixation on consuming human flesh. This grotesque practice, whispered about in fearful reverence, was said to grant the emperor supernatural strength and the elusive promise of eternal life. The envoy's initial disbelief gave way to a cold dread as he observed the subtle signs of this dark secret. The emperor's countenance, once described by envoys as formidable yet regal, now appeared gaunt and pallid. His eyes, sunken and hollow, betrayed a restless torment beneath the veneer of imperial authority. Those closest to him moved with a peculiar blend of reverence and terror, their loyalty overshadowed by fear of becoming the next victim of his gruesome appetite. The palace guards, normally stoic and unwavering, seemed jittery and distracted, their hands never far from the hilts of their swords. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, but mingled with it was an unsettling undertone, something metallic and raw that the envoy could not place. It was a subtle yet pervasive reminder of the unnatural acts concealed within these walls. At night, faint cries and muffled sounds echoed through the corridors, disappearing whenever anyone approached, as if the palace itself was haunted by the echoes of unspeakable deeds. The envoy's interactions with court officials further deepened his unease. Many appeared resigned, their faces etched with the fatigue of complicity or the weight of secrets too dangerous to divulge. One aged minister, speaking in hushed tones behind closed doors, revealed that the emperor's obsession had grown unchecked since his ascension to the throne. The pursuit of immortality had become a consuming madness, eclipsing even the emperor's political acumen and military genius. This dark chapter of Emperor Wu's reign was carefully concealed from the public eye. Official records praised his achievements and the stability he brought to the realm, but behind the polished veneer, the empire's heart beat with fear and revulsion. The emperor's insatiable hunger was fed by prisoners of war, dissidents, and those unfortunate enough to fall into the grasp of the imperial court. These victims were said to be selected under the veil of secrecy, their fates sealed by decrees whispered only in the dead of night. The envoy's report spoke of lavish banquets where the usual courses of roasted pheasant and exotic fruits were replaced by grotesque dishes whose ingredients were never named openly. The courtiers partook in these feasts with a mixture of dread and obligation, their faces masks of forced composure as they consumed the emperor's favored delicacies. To refuse was unthinkable, a silent admission of disloyalty that could lead to disappearance or worse. The psychological toll on those within the palace was immense. Servants and officials lived in a perpetual state of anxiety, their loyalty strained by the knowledge that the emperor's madness could consume anyone without warning. The envoy noted how fear had become a currency more valuable than gold within these walls, binding the court in a web of silence and submission. Even the emperor's closest confidants were shadows of themselves, their eyes reflecting a torment born not of physical pain but of witnessing acts that defied their humanity. Despite the horror, the envoy could not deny the aura of power that still clung to Emperor Wu. The unification of China under his banner was a feat unmatched in history, and his military campaigns had reshaped the continent. Yet this very power seemed to have become a prison, twisting his mind and spirit into something unrecognizable. The obsession with cannibalism was not merely an aberration but a symptom of a deeper rot, an empire's descent into darkness, mirrored by the unraveling of its ruler's sanity. The envoy's chronicles conveyed a sense of helplessness and foreboding. He portrayed a ruler trapped by his desires, a man whose quest for eternal dominion had led him down a path where the distinction between man and monster blurred. The palace, once a symbol of imperial glory, had become a place of whispered horrors and concealed atrocities. The envoy's words served as a warning to those beyond China's borders. Beneath the triumphant facade of unity and strength lay a secret so dark it threatened to consume the very soul of the empire. Thus, the envoy's arrival at the Qin imperial palace marked not the beginning of diplomatic success, but the entrance into a nightmare. The grandeur of Emperor Wu's reign was overshadowed by the chilling reality of his cannibalistic obsession, a dark secret that would ripple through the empire's history. The envoy's tale stands as a haunting prelude, drawing back the curtain on a sovereign whose quest for immortality led not to glory, but to madness and terror hidden behind the walls of power. Emperor Wu of Qin had not always been shrouded in the darkness that now seemed to envelop him. His rise to power was marked by brilliance and ruthless determination, qualities that had forged the first unified Chinese empire from the fractured warring states. Born as Yingzheng, he ascended the throne at a young age, inheriting a realm rife with discord and division. Yet, through strategic marriages, military conquest, and a relentless drive, he crushed his rivals and crowned himself the first emperor, a title signaling a new era of order and dominance. At the height of his reign, Emperor Wu was celebrated as a visionary who transformed the landscape of China. Roads and canals were constructed to link distant provinces, standardization of weights, currency, and script were enforced to bind the empire, and harsh but effective legal codes were instituted to maintain control. His military campaigns expanded borders and subdued rebellious factions with brutal efficiency. To outsiders, he was a symbol of strength and unassailable authority, a ruler whose power seemed destined to endure through the ages. But beneath this veneer of invincibility lay a man increasingly consumed by paranoia and fear. The immense responsibilities of empire weighed heavily on his psyche, and the shadows of betrayal and mortality loomed large in his thoughts. As years passed, the emperor's trust in those around him eroded. Ministers who once served loyally became suspects in his eyes, generals who secured victories were eyed with suspicion, and even family members were not spared the cloud of doubt. His court became a place where sycophants flourished, and honest counsel was drowned in a sea of flattery and fear. This growing isolation was the crucible in which his madness took root. Unable to reconcile the fragility of his power with the vastness of his empire, Emperor Wu turned to ancient texts and forbidden rituals, searching for ways to transcend the mortal coil. It was during this time that the emperor became fixated on the idea of consuming human flesh, a dark practice rooted in arcane beliefs that such an act would grant him supernatural vigor and eternal life. This obsession was not born of a sudden whim but evolved gradually, fueled by desperation and a mind unraveling under the weight of empire. Those within the palace who dared to glimpse the emperor's private chambers described a man transformed. The once commanding figure now appeared gaunt and restless, his eyes darting with a haunted intensity. His speech, once measured and authoritative, became fragmented and erratic, punctuated by moments of feverish muttering about immortality and power. Advisers who attempted to counsel reason were met with suspicion or outright hostility, their words twisted into evidence of conspiracy. The emperor's descent was marked by increasingly secretive and bizarre rituals. Court historians and chroniclers recorded, in veiled language, the presence of midnight ceremonies where the emperor sought to commune with spirits and harness forbidden energies. In these rites, human flesh was central, not merely as sustenance but as a sacrament believed to imbue the consumer with the essence of life itself. Prisoners condemned for political crimes or captured in battle were offered as grim tributes to this macabre hunger. The complicity of the emperor's inner circle was driven by a mixture of fear, loyalty, and pragmatism. Many courtiers recognized the peril in defying the sovereign's will, yet some harbored private revulsion at the emperor's practices. Whispers circulated of officials who had voiced concern, only to vanish without trace, swallowed by the shadows of the palace. Others were co-opted through promises of favor or threats, becoming unwilling participants in the emperor's dark quest. In the court, fear was a currency as potent as gold or rank. The emperor's temper, once a tool of firm governance, now veered into terrifying unpredictability. Outbursts of rage were common, with even minor slights provoking brutal punishments. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as courtiers navigated a treacherous landscape where a misplaced word or glance could spell doom. The emperor's obsession with cannibalism was not openly acknowledged, yet it hung over the court like a specter, shaping behavior and alliances. Despite these horrors, Emperor Wu's strategic mind remained intact in some measure. He continued to direct military campaigns and governance, albeit from a distance, delegating authority to trusted generals and ministers. This delegation, however, was laced with suspicion, and many officials operated under the shadow of potential accusations. The emperor's erratic decisions and unpredictability sowed confusion, weakening the cohesion that had once made the Qin Empire formidable. The emperor's deteriorating mental state was compounded by physical ailments that accompanied his dark practices. Some accounts describe a man ravaged by insomnia, plagued by nightmares, and haunted by visions of death and decay. His body, once robust from years of martial discipline, became frail and gaunt, bearing the marks of inner torment. The human flesh he consumed, rather than granting vitality, seemed instead to drain his health, feeding a cycle of obsession and decline. One particularly chilling account from a court physician, recorded in secret diaries later uncovered by historians, reveals the emperor's refusal to eat any food not prepared under his strict supervision. It was said that all meals were inspected for purity, and that the emperor demanded flesh from specific individuals believed to possess particular virtues or strengths. This grim ritual underscored the depth of his delusion, the belief that consuming certain people could transfer their qualities to himself, a grotesque mimicry of the natural world cycles of life and death. The emperor's growing isolation was both cause and effect of his madness. Those who might have intervened were silenced or marginalized, while the court became an echo chamber reinforcing his delusions. The once vibrant cultural life of the empire dimmed, replaced by a pall of secrecy and dread. Artists, scholars, and officials who had flourished under earlier reigns found themselves constrained, their work censored or redirected to glorify the emperor's divine aspirations. As the years wore on, the boundary between Emperor Wu's public persona and private torment blurred. His appearances became rarer and more unsettling. At public ceremonies, he stood rigid and expressionless, his eyes betraying a soul lost in darkness. His voice, once commanding and clear, had taken on a hollow, whispering quality. Even the grandest celebrations were tinged with unease, as courtiers cast furtive glances, wondering what horrors lay beneath the emperor's composed facade. The emperor's obsession also extended to the realm of the supernatural. He sought out shamans, alchemists, and mystics, desperate for elixirs and rituals that might prolong his life indefinitely. These figures, some genuine and others charlatans, fed into his paranoia and hunger for power, offering potions brewed from questionable ingredients and rites steeped in blood and sacrifice. The emperor's court became a theater of occult practices, where the line between faith and madness was perilously thin. This descent into madness did not go unnoticed beyond the palace walls. Envoys and diplomats from neighboring states reported unease and disquiet, noting the emperor's growing unpredictability and the dark rumors that clung to his reign. The unification of China, once hailed as a triumph of order and strength, now bore the marks of a fragile regime teetering on the brink of collapse, not from external threats, but from the internal decay wrought by the emperor's own hand. In the end, Emperor Wu's obsession with cannibalism and immortality was a tragic testament to the perils of absolute power unchecked by reason or compassion. His reign, once a beacon of unity and progress, had become a dark tale of madness and despair. The emperor, who had forged an empire through strength and vision, now stood as a figure consumed by his own fears and desires, a sovereign lost in the labyrinth of his mind, his quest for eternal life leading him ever deeper into the shadows. Within the shadowed depths of the Qin imperial palace, the grand halls that once echoed with the sounds of celebration and statecraft had become stages for a grisly theater of horror. The banquets held in Emperor Wu's private chambers were no longer mere displays of opulence and power, they had transformed into macabre spectacles where the line between sustenance and sacrilege was horrifyingly blurred. These gatherings, secret, exclusive, and shrouded in silence, were dominated by the emperor's insatiable craving for human flesh, a practice that cast a pall of terror over all who dwelled within the palace walls. The preparations for these banquets were conducted with a chilling precision. Victims, often prisoners of war, political dissidents, or unfortunate souls condemned by imperial decree, were selected under the veil of night. Their fates were sealed in whispered orders, their existence erased from official records as if to deny the very reality of the emperor's gruesome appetite. The servants tasked with preparing these forbidden meals bore the heavy burden of silence, their hands stained with the blood of those who vanished into the emperor's dark rituals. Courtiers who found themselves in attendance at these banquets did so under duress as much as duty. To decline the emperor's invitation was unthinkable, a silent acknowledgement of rebellion that could lead to exile or death. Yet the experience was suffused with dread. The guests sat stiffly around tables laden with dishes whose origins were never openly named, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. The usual aromas of roasted meats and fragrant spices were replaced by a subtle, unsettling scent, one that evoked decay and something far darker than mere flesh. Witnesses to these events described the emperor's demeanor as both commanding and grotesque. His visage, once regal, had become gaunt and pallid, eyes gleaming with a fevered intensity as he partook in the feast. The act of eating was a ritual unto itself. The emperor consumed the flesh with a reverence bordering on fanaticism, selecting portions said to embody the qualities he sought to absorb: strength, wisdom, vitality. Each bite was laden with symbolic weight, an attempt to harness the life force of others to stave off his own mortal decline. The courtiers' responses varied between forced composure and barely concealed revulsion. Some masked their horror behind rigid masks of loyalty, others whispered prayers for protection, while a few were said to have broken down in silent despair when freed from the emperor's gaze. The psychological strain was immense. To dine alongside a man who consumed human flesh was to confront a primal fear, a confrontation with mortality and the grotesque depths of power corrupted. Behind closed doors, the emperor's temper flared unpredictably, adding a layer of terror to the already grim proceedings. Outbursts could erupt over the slightest provocation: an improperly prepared dish, a hesitant toast, a perceived slight. Those who faltered in their duties faced swift and brutal punishment, reinforcing a climate of fear that permeated every corner of the palace. The banquets, though outwardly formal, were arenas where survival hinged on obedience and silence. The psychological toll on palace inhabitants extended beyond the banquets themselves. Servants who prepared the emperor's meals lived with the constant dread of discovery, their loyalty tested by the horrors they witnessed in the kitchens and storage chambers. Many were rumored to suffer from nightmares and breakdowns, their minds unable to reconcile the sacred duty to serve with the profane acts they were compelled to facilitate. The palace, once a beacon of culture and refinement, had become a prison of fear and silence. The sources of human flesh were a grim catalogue of the empire's darkest realities. Prisoners captured in the emperor's relentless campaigns were funneled into secret holding cells, their identities stripped away as they awaited their grim fate. Political enemies and those accused of treason found themselves condemned not only by law but by the emperor's insatiable hunger. Even members of the nobility were not immune. Whispers spoke of rivals who had vanished without trace, their disappearances quietly explained away as deaths by illness or accident. Despite the horrors, the emperor's obsession was cloaked in ritualistic significance. The consumption of human flesh was believed to be a conduit to divine power, a means of absorbing the virtues and strengths of the consumed. This belief was rooted in ancient traditions twisted into a grotesque form by the emperor's paranoia and desire for immortality. The banquets were as much religious ceremonies as they were feasts, with the emperor positioned as both sovereign and sacrificial victim, locked in a cycle of consumption and decay. The psychological environment within the court was suffused with silence and complicity. Fear suppressed dissent, while loyalty was coerced through a complex web of rewards and punishments. The courtiers lived in a delicate balance, their survival dependent on navigating the emperor's volatile moods and the unspoken rules of the palace. The emperor's cannibalistic practices were never spoken of openly, yet the knowledge of them was a constant shadow, shaping behavior and alliances. This atmosphere bred paranoia and distrust. Allies became suspect, friendships were strained by fear of betrayal, and the court was rife with intrigue born of desperation. The emperor's erratic behavior and dark rituals undermined the cohesion that had once held the empire together. The grand halls of the palace, once centers of power and celebration, echoed now with whispered fears and silent prayers for mercy. The impact on the broader governance of the empire was profound. The emperor's obsession diverted attention from statecraft to personal obsession. Decisions were increasingly influenced by superstition and desperation rather than strategy and reason. Military commanders and officials found themselves operating in an environment where the emperor's favor was unpredictable and where the shadow of his madness loomed over every decree. Amid this turmoil, the emperor's physical condition deteriorated. Accounts from chroniclers describe a man ravaged by his own compulsions, gaunt, restless, and haunted by visions that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. His health was fragile, undermined by the very rituals he believed would grant him strength. The grotesque banquets, intended to sustain him, instead fed a cycle of decline and obsession. The palace itself bore the marks of this dark era. Hidden chambers and secret passages, once used for statecraft and diplomacy, were repurposed for the emperor's sinister rituals. The kitchens, once bustling with activity, became places of grim preparation and hushed terror. Servants moved like shadows, their faces pale and eyes downcast, burdened by the knowledge of the horrors they enabled. Despite the fear and revulsion, the emperor's cannibalistic banquets remained a closely guarded secret, known only to a select few within the palace. The wider population remained largely unaware of the true nature of their sovereign's depravity, shielded by layers of secrecy and propaganda. To the outside world, Emperor Wu of Qin remained a figure of awe and power, his dark rituals concealed beneath the facade of imperial grandeur. Yet within the palace walls, the psychological toll was unrelenting. The courtiers and servants, trapped in a cycle of fear and obedience, lived daily with the knowledge that the emperor's madness could reach out and consume them at any moment. The banquets were more than displays of grotesque indulgence, they were instruments of terror, reinforcing the emperor's absolute control through the most primal of fears. In this grim tableau, Emperor Wu of Qin's reign stood as a chilling testament to the depths of human depravity when intertwined with absolute power. The emperor, once a unifier and visionary, had become a figure defined by his obsession and the horrors it wrought upon all who served him. The palace, a monument to imperial ambition, had been transformed into a crypt of hidden atrocities, where the line between ruler and monster vanished into darkness. The sinister practices within Emperor Wu of Qin's palace did not remain confined to the shadowed corridors and secret banquets, their repercussions rippled outward, shaking the very foundations of the empire he had so ruthlessly forged. The dark truth of the emperor's cannibalistic obsession, though veiled in secrecy within the court, began to seep into the consciousness of the broader ruling class and the empire's populace, sowing fear, revulsion, and unrest that would prove as destabilizing as any external enemy. Among the nobility and regional governors, murmurs of the emperor's depravity circulated with increasing urgency. Though direct evidence was scarce, carefully suppressed by loyalists and enforcers of the emperor's will, the whispered stories of human flesh consumed in imperial banquets cast a pall over the trust that bound the empire's vast bureaucracy. Where once there had been unwavering loyalty to the throne, now suspicion and dread took root. Governors who had once executed the emperor's commands without question began to hedge their allegiance, wary that association with the emperor's dark appetites might taint their own positions or invite fatal scrutiny. This atmosphere of fear and mistrust fractured the cohesion essential for governing an empire as expansive as Qin. Local officials, uncertain of the emperor's mental stability and increasingly fearful of becoming targets themselves, hesitated in their duties. Some indulged in covert opposition, while others sought to curry favor with rivals or factions positioning themselves for the inevitable power vacuum that seemed to loom on the horizon. The once tightly controlled administrative machinery began to sputter under the weight of internal discord. Among the common people, though largely shielded from the palace's horrors by layers of propaganda and censorship, rumors and fears nonetheless spread like wildfire. Traders, soldiers, and peasants spoke in hushed tones of unspeakable acts committed in the heart of the empire. Tales of vanished individuals, men and women who disappeared without cause, were woven into folklore, fueling anxieties about the reach of the emperor's madness. Such stories, though dismissed by some as superstition, eroded the reverence and awe that had once surrounded the imperial throne. These undercurrents of fear and suspicion did not merely unsettle the social fabric, they ignited active conspiracies within the empire's elite. Court officials and military leaders, alarmed by the emperor's erratic behavior and the growing instability, began to plot in secret. Some sought to protect the empire from the damage wrought by the sovereign's obsession, while others were driven by personal ambition, eager to seize power should the emperor falter. The palace became a hotbed of intrigue, where alliances shifted like shadows and trust was a dangerous commodity. The emperor's paranoia, fueled by his obsession and isolation, exacerbated these tensions. He reacted to perceived threats with ruthless efficiency, orchestrating purges that eliminated real and imagined enemies alike. These actions, intended to consolidate power, instead deepened the fractures within the ruling class. Fear bred further fear, and the cycle of suspicion and repression spiraled beyond the emperor's control. His once formidable grip on the empire weakened, undermined by the very terror he wielded to maintain it. Military commanders, too, felt the strain of the emperor's instability. Campaigns that had once been executed with precision and discipline became erratic, as orders were delayed, altered, or withdrawn without explanation. Troops, sensing the disarray in their leadership, grew restless and disillusioned. Some generals, disobeying direct commands, conspired with regional governors and court officials to safeguard their own positions, preparing for a future where the emperor's reign might end abruptly. The empire's borders, once secured by the might of Qin's legions, became vulnerable. Neighboring states, long wary of the emperor's ambitions, watched with keen interest as rumors of his madness and the internal chaos within the palace spread. Some saw opportunity in the empire's weakening grip, preparing to exploit its apparent decline. The very unity that Emperor Wu had fought so fiercely to achieve now seemed poised to unravel under the weight of his dark obsession. Public reaction to the spread of these rumors was a complex interplay of fear, superstition, and resentment. The emperor, once the embodiment of divine authority, became an object of whispered curse and dread. Folk songs and stories, passed quietly among the populace, painted a portrait of a ruler consumed by darkness, his insatiable hunger a metaphor for the empire's own looming demise. Such narratives, though suppressed by official censors, gained traction in rural areas and among those marginalized by the imperial system. This erosion of the emperor's legitimacy had profound implications. The sacred mandate that had justified his rule, the divine right to govern and protect the realm, was called into question not by open rebellion but through the gradual loss of respect and faith. Officials found themselves caught between loyalty to the throne and the practical need to preserve their own positions and the stability of their regions. The emperor's cannibalistic practices, once a secret indulgence, had become a political liability that threatened to unravel the entire imperial structure. Within the palace, the emperor's response to these mounting crises was a descent into further madness. Isolated and paranoid, he withdrew from public life, entrusting governance to a shrinking circle of loyalists whose own power was tenuous. His decisions became erratic, influenced more by superstition and fear than reason or counsel. The rituals that surrounded his cannibalistic obsession intensified, as if the emperor hoped to stave off the disintegration of his empire through supernatural means. The court itself became fractured and factionalized. Officials vied for influence, some seeking to steer the emperor toward stability, others exploiting his weakness for personal gain. The palace's atmosphere was thick with betrayal and suspicion, as alliances shifted with alarming frequency. The emperor's once commanding presence was reduced to a figurehead of terror, his decrees unpredictable and his moods volatile. The machinery of state, designed to function under a strong sovereign, groaned under the strain of his instability. As the empire's internal cohesion weakened, the seeds of rebellion took root. Dissident groups, emboldened by the emperor's evident decline, began to coalesce. These factions drew support from disaffected nobles, military officers, and common folk alike, those who had suffered under the rigid and often brutal rule of Qin but who now saw opportunity in the chaos. Rebellion was no longer a distant threat but an imminent reality, fueled by the eroding legitimacy of an emperor consumed by his own dark desires. The political ramifications of Emperor Wu's cannibalistic obsession thus extended far beyond the palace walls. What began as a private descent into madness had become a catalyst for widespread instability, undermining the empire's foundations. The fear and revulsion engendered by his practices fractured alliances, sapped loyalty, and invited open dissent. The empire, once a symbol of unyielding strength and unity, now teetered on the brink of disintegration. In this fragile moment, the very survival of the Qin dynasty hung in the balance. The emperor's quest for immortality had paradoxically accelerated the empire's decline, as his dark obsession corroded the trust and order essential to governance. The reverberations of his madness were felt not only within the gilded halls of the palace but across the sprawling lands of China, where the people and their rulers grappled with the terrifying reality of a sovereign undone by his own monstrous appetites. Emperor Wu of Qin's reign, once heralded as the dawn of a new unified China, ended not with triumphant legacy but with a descent into tragedy and ruin, consumed by the very darkness he had sought to harness. His obsession with cannibalism, born from an insatiable desire for immortality and absolute power, became the catalyst for his empire's unraveling and his own demise. The emperor, who had once commanded armies and shaped nations, was ultimately devoured by his own madness, leaving behind a legacy as cautionary as it was catastrophic. In the closing years of his life, the emperor grew increasingly isolated, a shadow of the formidable figure who had forged his empire through blood and steel. The corridors of the once magnificent palace echoed with silence, broken only by the faint, unsettling sounds of his private rituals. His health deteriorated rapidly, ravaged not only by age but by the physical and spiritual toll of his cannibalistic practices. Chroniclers who dared to record these final days spoke of a man gaunt and hollow-eyed, his body frail, his mind fractured by paranoia and despair. Attempts by his closest advisors to intervene met with failure. The emperor's belief in the power of his dark rituals was unshakable, even as those around him urged caution and reason. Physicians, mystics, and shamans were summoned in vain, their remedies and incantations unable to stem the tide of his decline. Some accounts describe bizarre ceremonies intended to purge evil spirits or restore vitality, rituals that only deepened the emperor's detachment from reality and further alienated those who remained loyal to him. The emperor's death was as solitary as his final years. Removed from public view, he succumbed in his private chambers, surrounded not by family or loyal subjects but by the lingering shadows of his obsession. The autopsy that followed revealed a body ravaged by disease and malnutrition, organs damaged beyond repair, a physical testament to the destructive consequences of his cannibalistic indulgence. The emperor's passing marked the end of an era, but not the restoration of order. Instead, it plunged the empire into a tumultuous period of uncertainty and power struggles. The fall of Emperor Wu served as a potent warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrosive effects of absolute power untempered by morality or reason. His story became a dark legend, recounted with horror and fascination by subsequent generations. It illustrated how the pursuit of immortality, when divorced from humanity, could lead to madness and destruction, not transcendence. The emperor's cannibalistic legacy was a grim emblem of his failure, a sovereign who sought to defy death but instead hastened it for himself and his empire. In the aftermath, the empire struggled to reconcile the grandeur of its achievements with the shadow cast by its rulers' depravity. The unification of China under Qin had laid the foundations for future dynasties, yet the memory of Emperor Wu's descent into darkness served as a stark reminder of the fragility of power and the perils that accompany its misuse. The dynasty he established was weakened, vulnerable to internal strife and external threats, as factions vied for control in the vacuum left by his demise. Historians and philosophers reflected on the emperor's life as a cautionary tale about the limits of human ambition. His reign underscored the necessity of wisdom and compassion in leadership, qualities absent in a sovereign consumed by fear and obsession. The emperor's cannibalistic practices, once secret and taboo, became symbolic of the broader consequences of tyranny unchecked by conscience. His story was invoked in moral teachings and political discourse as a lesson on the dangers of dehumanization and the importance of balancing power with humanity. The tale of Emperor Wu's cannibalistic obsession also raised profound questions about the nature of madness and the human condition. It exposed how isolation and absolute authority could distort the mind, transforming a ruler into a figure both feared and pitied. The emperor's attempts to transcend mortality through consumption of human flesh revealed a tragic misunderstanding of life's impermanence and the futility of resisting the natural order. Ultimately, Emperor Wu of Qin's life and death stand as a grim monument to the destructive potential of unchecked desire and the consequences of forsaking moral boundaries in the pursuit of power. His story resonates through history as a somber reminder that no sovereign, regardless of might or ambition, can escape the immutable laws of nature and humanity. The legacy of his cannibalistic reign is etched into the annals of time as both a warning and a tragedy, a sovereign who reached beyond the limits of his world and was devoured by the darkness within.